Hello, my name is Robert Nieri and I'd like to welcome all listeners to Shoosmith's very first charity podcast. In this podcast series, we will be looking at various topical issues for charities with the assistance of sector specialists. We're broadcasting as we look forward towards the beginning of the end of national lockdown, but with the charity sector still facing many challenges, in particular increasing demand, but more limited resources to meet it. Back in January, our Prime Minister promised further support financially to the charity sector, but unfortunately this was not forthcoming in this March's budget. So, without more government support, what should charities be doing to manage their available funds at this time? To answer this question, I'm very pleased to be joined by Peter Ryan, Divisional Director, and Hugh Draycott, Assistant Director of the award-winning charity investment managers, Brewin Dolphin. Good morning and welcome, gentlemen.
All right.
Morning, Robert. Thank you very much for having us.
Indeed.
You're very, very welcome. Before we start, as I'm a lawyer, you'd expect me to get the small print out of the way, and I'm now going to fulfill my lifetime's ambition as a radio jingles announcer. In this podcast, as you'll appreciate, Brewin Dolphin aren't giving investment advice. Legislation around investing can change, and when investing, your capital is at risk. Investment values can increase or decrease. Currency fluctuations will also have an impact on valuations when investing overseas, and future performance can differ from that of the past. So, without further ado, can I ask you, Hugh, in terms of what we've seen in the last 12 months, what has Brewin Dolphin seen charities doing in relation to their reserves and their reserves policies?
Thanks, Robert. I mean, it's a really interesting question, and I think it's been a very challenging time for charities across the board in reacting to COVID, and particularly the effects that COVID has had on their finances. But what it's really brought out, I think, is that internal struggle that charities always face in terms of providing for the needs of today against providing for the needs of tomorrow and ensuring that they have financial stability as an organization. We've got to stay pragmatic. I think, there are charities out there that would always love to have reserves or be in a position to build reserves. That's not always the case. But we've certainly seen a big difference in charities that potentially weren't able to build sufficient reserves to deal with the shocks that we've seen against those charities which have withdrawn in order to supplement any income or any shortfall in income from coronavirus and continue their activities in a way that meets their overall objectives. So that's, I think, the big difference that we've seen in the charities that we manage. And going forward, I think it's then going to be a case of really reevaluating what a reserves policy is, the benefit that a reserves policy can be, rebuilding that financial security, and not always seeing money that you're putting away for the future, i.e. money that you're putting away for reserves, as actually taking away from the ability that you could be meeting today's objectives with. Sometimes it's good to provide that financial stability for your organisation.
Thanks, Hugh. Would you like to add anything, Peter?
Yeah, it clearly has been probably the best example of why charities should keep reserves or have a reserves policy. If you just compare that to companies, for example, where there's no legislation in place for companies to carry reserves to be able to navigate difficult times, charities have had to. And I think it's fair to say there are far fewer charities will disappear as a result of COVID than perhaps companies. I think it does, therefore, it just highlights the need for proper planning and reserves policy. And also for charities to have the confidence in the future. Quite often we've heard in the past that charities have not been able to fundraise or receive donations or even government help because of the level of their reserves. But now, obviously, there is a very, very good example of why a charity needs to keep a substantial amount of reserves and yet carry on fundraising at the same time.
Thanks, Peter. Moving on, you're in the business of investing liquid assets. To what extent do you pay regard to the management of charities' illiquid assets. So, for example, at this time, I can imagine many charities are looking hard at their property portfolio, if they have one, in terms of looking either to sell or to borrow on the back of their freehold property.
Yeah.
Alternatively, to de-restrict restricted funding or to release permanent endowment, for which a case would need to be made to the Charity Commission. How does that have a bearing on how you advise and manage and invest liquid funds for charities?
Okay, well, our view is very much that an investment manager shouldn't consider the portfolio they're managing in isolation. That portfolio is a part of reserves, and therefore CC19 is as important as CC14. And we need to take a holistic view in advising about the planning of a reserves policy. Although we don't or can't advise on property transactions or raising loans, creating liabilities, we certainly would be taking those into account when advising on reserves policy. So we're looking all the way through from illiquid assets, as you say, and borrowing, then to liquid assets, which may be deemed as working capital to cover sort of mismatches of income and expenditure throughout the year, and then amounts which are earmarked for projects, say, from now to 3 years out. And then finally, what may be termed the long-term investments, which could be under consideration for an investment portfolio.
Okay, thank you. Thanks, Peter. Can I turn to you, Hugh, now for my final question? What do you think the COVID crisis over the last 12 months will mean for the formulation of reserves policies for charities in future?
I think what we can take is, and when Peter and I ever look at an investment policy, I think the key word that we always talk about and reiterate is suitability. And I think that really needs to be all the way through a charity's financial planning. And so that reserves policy has to be suitable in meeting and helping the charity meet its overall aims. And so that's understanding how that reserves policy looks through and is in line with what you're doing as an organisation. You then have the benefit of being able to externalise that policy and showcase the story that you're telling to the wider public and how you're a well-governed and considerate charity, and ensuring that that policy is then flexible enough to meet environment. So that question of suitability is never fixed. The reserves policy and your investment policy need to shift with a changing environment, and I think it's about replaying those conversations, re-evaluating how that reserves policy and potentially any investments interact with the charity, and ensuring that it continues to do that into the future.
Thank you, Hugh. Peter, anything to add?
Yeah, very much so. Suitability is top priority, and again, just bringing that investment portfolio back into the holistic view of total reserves. We call it 3 buckets, as I've talked about: the more liquid day-to-day working capital, near-term projects, and then what might be available for long-term investments. We review when we take on a new client. That is reviewed and is part of our advice initially, and we would review that at a minimum and report back to the charity, replay that back to the charity once a year, or if there was a material change in the charity's circumstances, financial or otherwise, between those times.
Thank you, Peter. And thank you, Hugh, both of you, for your thoughts, which I'm sure will be of great interest to those charities listening to this podcast. We already know that the Charity Commission is going to consult on revised guidance on responsible investments, and that's to be published in draft for consultation anytime now. I hope you'll both be able to join us once we have the draft guidance and we can resume our conversation then.
Delighted, yeah.
Thank you.
Absolutely.
In the meantime, thank you to you, the listeners, for joining us for this first podcast. And if you're interested in receiving details of future podcasts, then please just contact me at robert.nieri shoesmiths.co.uk. Finally, feel free to register to join us for our 30-minute charity trustee legal updates on the 21st and the 28th of April, details of which are on the Shoesmiths events webpage. Thank you and goodbye.